Today I want to talk about Dorne, but what I want to focus on is the immense similarities between Dorne and Wales. And just to clarify, we were talking about Dorne from the books, not the hot mess David and Dan made of the Dornish plot in the show. A few months ago I was in work and I had nothing to do, so I was thinking about A Song of Ice and Fire and making a list. I was matching up who represented who from the War of the Roses in A Song of Ice and Fire with the idea of making a video, but then suddenly, out of the blue, it hit me. Dorne and Wales play similar roles and have similar histories to each other, and that is what we are going to talk about today. The first couple of similarities between Dorne and Wales are geographical. There is the position of the countries. Wales is on the left of England and Dorne is on the right of Westeros. There is also, of course, the legend that Ireland and Wales were once joined by a land bridge, which was eventually swallowed by the sea. Doesn't that sound a lot like the hammer of the waters and the breaking of the arm of Dorne? There is also the Dornish marches. The word marches was originally used in the Middle Ages to denote the marches, that means the border, between England and the Principality of Wales. In the marchers, there were marcher lords, who had specific rights, exercising some extent of independence from the King of England. The word marches is only used in history when referring to the border between England and Wales. In A Song of Ice and Fire, the word marches is only used to describe the border between Dorne, the Stormlands and the Reach. Is this a simple coincidence? I think not. George R.R. Martin plans everything thoroughly, and this detail will not have escaped his notice. There is not a lot of sun symbolism in Welsh history, probably because there isn't a lot of sun in Wales, but there is a lot of reference to spears in medieval Welsh history. Spears are even mentioned in great detail in medieval poetry, especially medieval Welsh poetry. We know George R.R. Martin is a big fan of poetry. A Song of Ice and Fire was even inspired by the Robert Frost poem Fire and Ice.
Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favour fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice.
Another thing that Wales and Dorne have in common is they both give their rulers the title prince instead of king, and both are alone in doing so. I think George R.R. Martin put this detail in on purpose as a big hint. Wales has its own culture which stands outside of the rest of the UK, and so does Dorne. This is what George R.R. Martin had to say on Dornish culture.
Dorne is a very special land with a slightly different cultural basis than the rest of Westeros. It was politically apart for a long time. It was also culturally apart because of the Rhoynar and the traditions they brought, but they didn't influence the rest of Westeros so much.
Wales was also politically apart from the UK for a long time. There were 5 great wars fought against Welsh princes by kings of England during the Middle Ages, and hundreds of skirmishes throughout that time. Dorne followed the same pattern. There were 4 Dornish wars fought by Targaryens.
He did not conquer here. Elsewhere he burnt his foes, him and his sisters. But here we melted away before them, leaving only stone and sand for them to burn. And round the dragons went, snapping at their own tails for want of any other food, till they were tied in knots.
The Targaryens, however, were determined to succeed, and there were prices put on the heads of Dornish lords. The Dornish retaliated by doing the same thing to the Targaryen family, even threatening to get the Faceless Men involved. It was common practice for English monarchs to put prices on the heads of Welsh rebels. But the Welsh and the Dornish were determined to maintain their independence, and both relied heavily on guerrilla tactics to make up for their lack of numbers.
You may burn us down, my lady, but you will not bend us, break us, or make us bow. This is Dorne. You are not wanted here. Return at your peril.
Both Dorne and Wales were eventually brought into the fold through marriage. In the real world, this was done over many decades with lots of intermarriage, but in A Song of Ice and Fire it was a lot more final, with good King Daeron marrying Princess Myrcella Martell.
When good King Daeron wed Princess Myrcella and brought us into the Seven Kingdoms, it was agreed Dornish law would always rule in Dorne.
There is also a lot of interesting symbolism when it comes to Welsh and Dornish heraldry and banners. House Centacar of Spotwood and House Faith both have leopards on their banners. Leopards, of course, are part of the English royal family's coat of arms. There is also the Blood Royal, House Yronwood. Their sigil is a black portcullis. This sigil is actually exactly the same as the sigil used by Margaret Beaufort and the Beaufort family. Margaret Beaufort, of course, was the mother of the Tudor dynasty. I believe all this symbolism deserves closer scrutiny, but that's for my next video. Back to Welsh symbolism. Wales has a very distinctive flag. It consists of a red dragon on a field of green and white. The white and green stand for the Tudor house colours, and the story behind the red dragon on the flag is very reminiscent of the Targaryens trying to conquer Dorne.
There was a Celtic king on the lookout for somewhere to build a castle. Eventually, finding a spot he liked on a hillside, he set his men to work. A young boy called Merlin approached and warned Vortigern that the site he had in mind for his castle was directly above an underground lake, where 2 dragons lay sleeping. On digging the ground to start the castle's construction, Vortigern's men found 2 dragons, one red, one white, fighting fiercely. After a fearsome battle, the red dragon won.
Queen Rhaenys' dragon Meraxes, who was killed in the First Dornish War, was silver and white. Is that not spookily similar? And the red victorious dragon, of course, represents the Targaryen banner. So we have established that Wales and Dorne have a lot in common, and we know that A Song of Ice and Fire was inspired by the War of the Roses. And who won the War of the Roses in the end? The Tudors. And where did the Tudors come from? Wales, of course. So, who is the most likely person to rise out of Wales to seek the Iron Throne? I would say Young Griff. There is the possibility that the red dragon in the Welsh myth could represent Daenerys, and the white dragon could represent Young Griff, but I think not. As I have said in previous videos, I believe Young Griff is a Blackfyre pretender. Maybe Dorne will rise up to help Young Griff, believing he is Elia's son. Or maybe Dorne will rise up and put another person on the throne. You will have to watch my next video to find out who I think that is. Until next time, we remain unbowed, unbent, and unbroken. Today I want to talk about House Yronwood. This is a concept that occurred to me a few months ago, while I was thinking about making my video about how Dorne was the Wales of Westeros. I was looking through the Dornish house sigils, and it suddenly hit me out of the blue. The Yronwood sigil is exactly the same as the coat of arms used by the Beauforts, which is a black portcullis. For anybody who doesn't know, the Beaufort family are the family that give the Tudor dynasty their claim to the throne. The Beaufort's claim to the throne comes from John of Gaunt, who was the 3rd son of Edward III, but the Beauforts were originally bastards. John of Gaunt had with his mistress, Catherine Swynford, but later, after John of Gaunt was widowed, he married Catherine and legitimised their 3 sons and 1 daughter, with the understanding that none of them could ever claim the throne because they were born outside wedlock. Doesn't that sound an awful lot like the legitimization of the Great Bastards by King Aegon IV Targaryen? And when we think of Great Bastards, who do we think of? We think of the Blackfyres, don't we? And Bloodraven. You might be asking around now, where do the Yronwoods fit in? And this is a video about House Yronwood and how I believe they represent the Tudors. The Tudors, of course, originate from Wales. And if you haven't seen my video on why Dorne is the Wales of Westeros, you should go and check it out. The link will be in the description of this video. House Yronwood of Yronwood is the most powerful house in Dorne after the ruling family, the Martells. Their seat is Yronwood. It is the last fortress defending the Boneway. This is reflected in their title, the Warden of the Stoneway. House Yronwood claimed the title High King of Dorne before the arrival of the Rhonar, and the head of the Yronwood family still style themselves the Blood Royal. A little pretentious, don't you think? Especially for a bannerman. According to semi-canon sources, their motto is "We guard the way," and their sigil is a black portcullis on a field of sand. So we know the Yronwoods view themselves as the protectors of Dorne, protecting Dorne from the rest of Westeros, just like the Tudor brothers, Edmund and Jasper, protected Wales. The current heir to House Yronwood in A Song of Ice and Fire is called Gwyneth. Gwyneth is a traditional Welsh name meaning happiness, and as we know, George R.R. Martin puts an awful lot of emphasis on people's names and the importance behind them. So, I feel it is very important to mention that the Tudors claim descent from Myrcella ap Sad, Lord of Roche and protector of Rhodri, the great king of Gwynedd. That is quite a mouthful to try and say, and I apologize to any native Welsh speakers if I have pronounced any of it incorrectly, but one thing in the name stood out to me. Doesn't Gwynedd sound an awful lot like Gwyneth? And I had to look it up, and Gwynedd even has a similar meaning. It means white, happiness, or blessed. So, could these two words be interchangeable? I looked it up and it turns out they could be, as there are different dialects throughout Wales, and they could simply be the same word from different regions, spelt and pronounced slightly differently. So, we have established the similarities between the Tudors and Yronwoods when it comes to their house's sigil and the meanings of their first names. We have also established that the Yronwoods come from Dorne, and Dorne is a representation of Wales in A Song of Ice and Fire. We also know that the Tudors come from an originally bastardized, then legitimized royal line, just like the Blackfyres. You might be asking why I keep bringing up the Blackfyres, and isn't it a great big leap to go 1, 2, 3 things in common? Here come the Blackfyres, but hold on a minute. We know from the World of Ice and Fire that the Yronwoods joined Sir Aegor Rivers in the Blackfyre rebellions, not once, not twice, but 3 times, turning against the Targaryens and the Martells, to whom they owed their loyalty. So, why does a large, powerful house join a rebellion 3 times? Once you could maybe understand, perhaps they wanted to make a move for power, grab Dorne back from the Martells, but 3 times in a row, each time facing failure, treason, and execution? That speaks to me of far more than simple power play. I think there probably is a family tie between the Yronwoods and Blackfyres, just like the Tudors and the Lancastrians were intermarried, especially because we know many of the Yronwoods have blonde hair and blue eyes. Many of the Targaryens also have blonde hair and blue eyes instead of the trademark silver and purple. Good Queen Alysanne, for example. Alysanne was a small woman, slim of waist and slight of frame. She was small-breasted, with a long neck and fair complexion, a high forehead and high cheekbones. Alysanne was often described as pretty, but seldom as beautiful. She had blue eyes and honey-coloured curls. So maybe there was a marriage somewhere in the past linking the Yronwoods and Blackfyres together. Maybe more than one marriage, as we only have 3 generations of the Yronwood family tree, and each time the wife is listed as unknown. This is very unlike George R.R. Martin, as he is normally very thorough in his world building. So I went back and had a look at the great bastards of King Aegon IV Targaryen, and I remembered that Brynden Rivers, better known as Bloodraven, had 2 older sisters, Maya Rivers and Gwenny Rivers. We know virtually nothing about Bloodraven's sisters apart from their names, and the name Gwenny's looks far too much like Gwyneth, the current heir to House Yronwood, for my comfort, so I decided to look up the meaning of the name Gwynny's. And guess what? It is a Welsh girl's name, and it means fair one, soft and white, or blessed, which is nearly exactly the same as the meaning of the region of which the Tudors hail from, Gwynedd, which means white happiness or blessed. I honestly think there are too many names and sigil similarities to simply dismiss this theory, As we know how much thought, time, and effort goes into George R.R. Martin's name choices for his characters, I personally believe House Yronwood will form the backbone of the 6th Blackfyre Rebellion and join Young Griff, just like the Tudors always formed the backbone of the Lancastrian rebellions. There is also this quote I picked up from Ariane Martel in A Feast for Crows, where she is discussing the current head of House Yronwood, Andres, and how he is a chauvinist who believes in male succession, while he is talking to Ares Oakhart. Andres Yronwood is Criston Cole reborn. He whispers in my brother's ear that he should rule after my father, that it is not right for men to kneel to women, that Ariane especially is unfit to rule, being wilful and wanton as she is. It does not sound to me like Andres Yronwood would be supporting Daenerys Targaryen any time soon if that is his attitude to female rulers. So, until we get the Winds of Winter, or the second installment of Fire and Blood, let me leave you with the wise words of Tyrion Lannister. How many Dornishmen does it take to start a war? Only one.
Today I want to talk about the Blackfish, also known as Brynden Tully, and the only Tully worth a damn. The last time we see Brynden Tully is at Riverrun before he makes his daring escape, and the castle surrenders to Jaime Lannister, who is waiting outside with a Frey host. When the Kingslayer discovers that the Blackfish has escaped, he thinks to himself, Brynden Tully will keep on fighting no matter what. He even suspects him of joining up with Beric Dondarrion and the Brotherhood without banners. But I do not think this is the way for Brynden Tully to keep on fighting. The Blackfish is a seasoned warrior, and I believe he will join up with Aegon Targaryen, better known as Young Griff. I believe he will join Aegon and the Golden Company at Storm's End. From Riverrun to Storm's End, it is 860 miles minimum. I did the math and looked it all up on Westerosi maps, which would take 46 days to walk if you walked 12 hours a day. If Brynden Tully managed to get himself a horse, which is extremely possible, perhaps from House Blackwood, one of the only remaining houses in the Riverlands still holding out for Robb Stark, he could make the journey in 29 to 30 days. So he would be in time to meet Aegon at Storm's End. Perhaps Brynden will do something similar to Barristan Selmy, getting to know Aegon before swearing him loyalty. Sir Brynden is extremely loyal to his family and will not want to see the Tully name die out, and Riverrun pass to the Freys, so Aegon is the logical person to join up with, as he is fighting the Lannisters as well. Sir Brynden also seems to take his knightly vows very seriously. Knights swear to defend their king and obey their king. I believe Sir Brynden will consider the Targaryen heir the rightful king, now that Robb Stark and Robert Baratheon are both dead. I believe it is extremely possible that Brynden and Edmure swore an oath to, where possible, restore the Tully name. They did have quite a few hours to talk and come up with a plan. It was probably Brynden's plan, as Edmure seems to be not the brightest bunny in the pen, but he does seem to be the smartest and kindest of the Tully siblings. There is also quite a lot of foreshadowing that the Blackfish will be loyal to the Targaryens again. We know that before Robert's rebellion, Brynden Tully fought for the Targaryens in the Stepstones in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, also known as the 5th Blackfyre Rebellion. He won
praise and valor for his bravery during battle. There is also the small point that the Blackfish is named after Brynden Rivers, also known as Bloodraven. And we all know how much emphasis George R.R. Martin likes to put on his characters' names, so I believe this point is very significant. We also know that Edmure and his pregnant wife are travelling to comfortable imprisonment at Casterly Rock, and if the Blackfish wants to help free Edmure, he is going to join the people fighting the Lannisters, because this will be his best hope of freeing Edmure. If Edmure is freed, I believe the Riverlands will rally around him, and if he owes his freedom to Aegon Targaryen, the River Lords would be a great boost to Aegon's cause. Jon Connington will see this for sure, and promote Brynden Tully as an advisor and ally. Jon Connington will also see that having somebody like the Blackfish on side will lend credibility to Aegon. Whether he is a pretender or not, I believe Jon Connington may also name Sir Brynden to Aegon's Kingsguard, making Aegon's story and Brynden's story run parallel to that of Daenerys and Barristan Selmy. But we're going to have to wait for Winds of Winter to find out whether Brynden Tully is going to turn up anywhere at all, but I think if he turns up, he's going to turn up right next to Aegon.
Today we are talking about the Forgotten Princess, Myrcella Baratheon, and how she is going to be very important in the Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. I was doing some research for my video on how House Yronwood represent the Tudors in A Song of Ice and Fire when I came across something significant. Myrcella Baratheon and Jane Grey have the same coat of arms, a yellow or white lion rampant on a field of scarlet. The colour of the grey lion seems to be interchangeable, so I'm going ahead with it, and after doing some more research on the subject, there were too many parallels between the two young women to simply dismiss. You might be wondering at this point who the Lady Jane Grey is, and though she was not around for very long, she was extremely important for a short time. The Lady Jane Grey was the fiercely intelligent eldest daughter of Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk, and his wife Frances Brandon. She was also the great-great-granddaughter of Henry VII. The Lady Jane Grey was treasonously proclaimed queen after the death of her cousin Edward VI, but tragically she only reigned for 9 days. Jane was overthrown by her cousin, the rightful Queen Mary I, and though Jane Grey was the first woman to be proclaimed queen in England in her own right, nobody remembers her. She was executed soon after Mary came to the throne, at the tender age of 16. It is said she went to her execution bravely. I believe Myrcella's fate will mirror that of the tragic Jane Grey, and I have seen many similarities leading me to this conclusion, including the coat of arms similarity. Jane Grey was renowned before she became queen for her fierce intelligence, and Myrcella is also known to be very smart. She displays this in A Feast for Crows when she immediately takes to Syvas and starts beating Prince Trystane on a regular basis.
He had left her in her chambers, bent over a gaming table opposite Prince Trystane, pushing ornate pieces across squares of jade, cornelian, and lapis lazuli. Myrcella's full lips had been slightly parted, her green eyes narrowed with concentration. Syvas the game was called. Prince Trystane had taken to the game at once, and Myrcella had learned it so she could play with him. She was not quite 1 in 10, her betrothed 3 in 10. Even so, she had been winning more often than not of late. Trystane did not seem to mind.
However, Myrcella and the Lady Jane Grey have a lot more in common though than them simply both being intelligent, well-educated young women. Both girls have 2 siblings. Myrcella has Tommen and Joffrey, and Jane has 2 sisters, Catherine and Mary.
But the slightly more important fact is that Jane's youngest sister Mary was a dwarf, who was despised by her parents Henry and Francis due to her medical condition and traumatic birth. Doesn't that sound an awful lot like our favourite character, Tyrion Lannister, and his relationships with Cersei and Tywin? The Lady Jane Grey was reportedly always kind to her youngest sister, and I believe this relationship is mirrored in the way Tyrion and Myrcella interact.
Myrcella came running after her brother, and the dwarf picked her up by the waist and spun her in a circle, squealing. When he lowered her back to the ground, the little man kissed her lightly on the brow and came waddling across the yard toward Joffrey. "I'm glad you're not dead," said Princess Myrcella.
Tyrion even considered crowning Myrcella for a while, because he was always fond of her, and she was always kind to him. But in the end Tyrion decides not to crown Myrcella, because he knows it would be her death sentence. But more than once he thinks back fondly on Myrcella, and is thankful that she is nothing like her mother.
She had all of her mother's beauty, and none of her nature.
Let us not forget that both Myrcella and Jane have very ambitious mothers, who are both well known for being needlessly cruel. When Frances Brandon told Jane that she was to marry Guilford Dudley, Jane refused. Jane's refusal to marry made Frances so angry she swore at Jane and slapped her across the face. When that did not convince Jane to agree to the marriage, Frances gave Jane a brutal whipping until the girl capitulated and wed. Cersei is also well known for having people whipped. There is Alalaya, who Cersei has whipped to punish Tyrion, and more importantly there is Pate, Tommen's whipping boy, who Cersei repeatedly has beaten to make Tommen capitulate with her wishes. Myrcella and Jane are also both largely forgotten about until they are innocents used in rebellious plots. Jane is used by her father-in-law, John Dudley, and Myrcella is used by her sister-in-law, Arianne Martell. Do you see a pattern emerging? Myrcella is also betrothed to Tristan Martell, a boy of a similar age, which is a little uncommon in a medieval world where girls with royal blood can get married to men twice their age with no one batting an eye. And Jane is also married to Guilford Dudley, who is only a year or two older than herself. Both marriages were also arranged to cement alliances between families. Also, let's not forget that Myrcella herself and many others believe herself to be a Baratheon, and therefore the great-great-granddaughter of a Targaryen princess on that side. And Jane Grey's grandmother was a Tudor princess, so the parallels continue. Arianne Martell seems to have given up all hope of crowning Myrcella, but I think the Sand Snakes are playing the long game and might try to cement another rebellion during the chaos that will follow Cersei blowing up the Great Sept of Baelor. This new plot will focus on using religious fervor to crown Myrcella. Religion, of course, was the main reason for crowning Jane Grey. If the Sand Snakes succeed in having Myrcella crowned Queen Regnant, she'll be, like Jane Grey, the first woman to officially rule in her own right. But also, like Jane Grey, I believe Myrcella's reign will be short, and she will be overthrown by Daenerys Targaryen, who will go down in history as Daenerys I, in a true parallel to Mary I, better known as Bloody Mary, which would also mirror the books, if they followed the TV show at all. Mary I agonized for months about putting her cousin Jane Grey to death, and Daenerys may find herself in a similar predicament. Jane Grey went to her beheading bravely, and we know from the books Myrcella is brave.
The truth was, the princess was braver than her brother, and brighter and more confident as well. Her wits were quicker, her courtesies were more polished. Nothing daunted her, not even Joffrey.
I believe the formal putting to death of Princess Myrcella Baratheon will turn the King's Landing crowd against Daenerys, and cause her eventual spiral and the burning of the city. I believe we got a foreshadowing of this when Myrcella took her leave for Dorne, and the crowd on the way back to the Red Keep attacked Joffrey and the leaving party.
The girl never wept. Young as she was, Myrcella Baratheon was a princess born, and a Lannister despite her name. Tyrion reminded himself as much Jaime's blood as Cersei's. To be sure, her smile was a shade tremulous when her brothers took their leave of her on the deck of the Sea Swift, but the girl knew the proper words to say, and she said them with courage and dignity. When the time came to part, it was Prince Tommen who cried and Myrcella who gave him comfort.
Could the scene I just quoted above be a final farewell from this world? And both scenes will be witnessed by Tyrion, book-ending Myrcella Baratheon's short life, and ending with Tyrion reflecting on how true it was that to crown her was to kill her. You might be wondering at this point about Myrcella's look-alike cousin Rosamund, and where she fits into my theory, as everyone likes to talk about Rosamund a lot and has their own theories about who it was that Darkstar really attacked. I believe it was Rosamund in the Arianne Rebellion, and that Myrcella remains safe and unharmed. My reason for thinking this is simple. The name Rosamund is of Germanic origin, and it means horse protection. And where was the supposed Myrcella injured? On horseback, of course. So I believe Rosamund Lannister is nothing more than a red herring put into the story by George R.R. Martin to try and distract us, because we all know how much emphasis George R.R. Martin puts on his name meanings for his characters. On the subject of names and the importance George R.R. Martin puts on them when it comes to creating his characters, I feel it is very important to point out the meaning of the name Myrcella. Myrcella is a variant of the Latin name Marcella, which means warlike, and doesn't that tell you everything you need to know about Princess Myrcella Baratheon and her storyline in A Song of Ice and Fire? Until we get the Winds of Winter, we can only continue to speculate. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my other A Song of Ice and Fire content. I have a couple of videos covering Dorne, and quite a few covering Winterfell and Sansa Stark. Also, leave a comment on your thoughts on Myrcella Baratheon. Do you see the parallels with the Jane Grey story? And where do you think Rosamund is going to turn up? Until next time, remember, a Lannister always pays his debts.